Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And about 3 days ago, we went as a family. So I have my two boys here this summer with us. We are spending some time with them. They usually live with their mom about 3 hours away, but they're visiting us. And about 3 days ago, we took the whole family, all five of us, Antonia, myself, Piper, and my two boys, to go see the brand new Pixar Disney movie called Inside Out. It came out literally like 3 days ago. We went to see...
like the first showing.
It was like 10 o'clock in the morning, right?
I was really excited. I love Pixar movies.
I was too. I've been waiting for this for like 6 months. And it was, I'll tell you what, this was one of the most interesting movie-going experiences that I've been through in probably... I don't even remember the last time I was in a movie experience that was this emotionally profound for me. Weirdly enough, during this movie, so let me kind of give you background. So Inside Out is the new Disney Pixar movie. It's talking about a lot about the emotions that we feel as humans, and it basically goes into how our emotions play into our personalities. Right? That's what the whole animated movie's about. Yeah. During this movie, I almost cried probably about 4 or 5 times. Now I didn't cry. I gained composure, but I almost teared up during this movie about 4 or 5 times, which is very weird for me. I never, ever cry at movies or even feel like I'm going to cry at movies.
I totally cried. I cried like twice.
Yeah.
I do cry at movies though.
And what the weird thing about it, it's not a very emotionally charged movie. Like there's other movies I've seen that have way more emotional charge to them.
I never cry when a movie is emotionally charged. I cry when it pulls something out of me that I feel is lost. Like the movie Where the Wild Things Are. When the credits started rolling, I started weeping. And the only thing I could think of is I was like crying for my lost childhood or something. It's very maudlin nostalgic when I start crying. It's usually when I lose something. I don't know if I would have called it an emotionally profound movie, but I know that it was a provocative movie.
I think the word I would use is poignant. I don't know why I would use that. Yeah. That's the first word that came to my mind right now. Kind of just going with it. But yeah, that's the word I think was like... It hits something like you're talking about, like some kind of a nostalgic, like level up viewpoint or a shift in my perspective, or at least a recognition of what I already think or something. I don't know exactly what I mean by that.
Yeah, well, if for anybody who hasn't seen it, we're not going to talk about spoilers or anything, but for anybody who hasn't seen it, I don't know if I would go into it thinking that you're going to have like a different understanding about emotions necessarily. I don't know if it was like a massively insightful movie in and of itself about emotions, but I do know that it spawned a lot of interesting conversations. I think because it took a very complex subject matter, which is how our emotions are working within us. It took this very complex subject matter and, simplified it for a viewing audience that's probably going to be about the median age of about 10 years old. So I thought it was really well done in that regard. But you and I had a really interesting conversation on the way out of the theater that really spawned this, I think where this podcast is most likely headed, at least it's headed in my mind. We talked about, again, I don't want to give any spoilers, but there was an insinuation that the emotions were in control of the main character, a little girl named Riley, who was about 11 years old. And you were kind of disappointed that they didn't have more of Riley controlling her own emotions. It felt like the emotions themselves were in control. And then my question was, well, the emotions are Riley. So if the emotions were in control, that means that Riley was in control because the emotions are following her cognitive, direction or orders, even if they're unconscious. So all of this that's happening inside of her own mind is basically her making it happen, or is it? And then that got us going on a conversation about just how in control are we over our emotions, over our mind, over our choices, like what's on autopilot, what's happening behind the scenes that we can't even see, and what is consciously directed choice. Because I think we attribute to ourselves a lot more choice than we actually get. I think we attribute to ourselves a lot more ability to choose our fate than we actually get. And then at the same time, it feels like we don't think we're in control at all. We just completely hand our power to to other people. So the big question is just how in control are we over ourselves?
Yeah, and we've talked about this topic on other podcasts before about the idea that, so in the systems thinking podcast, we talked about how everything is an emergent of a system. There's no cause and effect. And by the time you get to a choice in your life, you've probably already set up the circumstances to make whatever's going to happen inevitable, no matter what you think you can control in the moment. The choice has been made, before that. We've kind of hinted at this before. And I think this movie really brought it out in a poignant, I'll use the word again, poignant way, that our choices are almost pre-made for us. We kind of get to this decision level, and we've done a lot up until that point when that choice now is presented, that I bet you if you look at your life and you look at the major decision points, you'll realize that at those decision points, those choices were actually made months, if not years, before those decision points came about.
Yeah.
And the other thing about, I just want to make sure I echo what you said. The other thing about this movie was, and I agree with you, there was nothing particularly special about it. It was not I've seen other movies that were way more epic, way more earth-shattering. For example, the movie The Matrix was much more of an eye-opening and mind-altering experience for me, right? I don't have any emotion around that movie, but that was much more of a big aha moment when I saw that movie. And there's other movies like that I've had experiences with, or other books I've read, or whatever. And I think this movie in particular, I just want to make sure I mention this, I think the reason why it was so emotional is because how personal it seemed to me for some reason. It seemed like a very, you got to go inside, and this is probably me as an authenticity person, right? In my personality, you got to see someone's personal experience of their mind, of their emotions, of how they thought, of the things that most people would never see about another person. Like, there's one part in here where you're introduced to the imaginary friend this little girl had when she was a younger kid, right? And we've all had an imaginary friend, and I was resonating with some of these themes, some of this architecture of the mind, some of the things that you've forgotten from childhood that this movie reminded you of. I think that was something else that I think was poignant in this. It was it had a nostalgic feeling. It wasn't nostalgic, but it had that feeling about it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think there were parts that were, I think, intentionally nostalgic. I think it was extremely well done. I think it was really well done, too, in the sense that it helps gain some sympathy for what's happening inside of another person when they have confusing, moods. Like, what's going on behind a mood? There's a lot of stuff going on behind a mood. I think, too, one thing that was really fascinating to me, too, is if you have seen the movie, you can retrospectively sort of see this or point this out. And if you haven't seen it, look for it. But which of because it grossly oversimplified the emotions that were in control. There was only 5 of them. But which emotion was at the helm in which person? Like, whenever it zoomed into another character and showed their emotional sort of setup or stack, there was a different person that was the primary, or there was a different emotion that was the primary, at the helm, that's so, quote unquote driver of different people. So I thought that was a really interesting way of indicating why a person might have a mood that's, happening over and over for them. But again, I feel like what it really pointed out to me was, sometimes we feel really jerked around by our emotions as if they are anthropomorphic, as if they are other beings inside of us. And to some extent, they kind of are. I think that when we go inside of ourselves, we tend to compartmentalize all of these pieces of who we are. We tend to compartmentalize the emotions, and we feel like we're in their grip, as if they are at the helm, right? Like that we're just sort of going with them, whatever their whim is. And then I think, but they're all part of me. So again, that's the theme that keeps coming up for me is what is in control? Is it these individual emotions within me, or the cacophony of emotions, or is it me holistically? And I think the answer that I've been coming up with is I think it's both. I think we are the holistic, me, whatever that is. I am the holistic Antonia, the set of all of these, the whole that is greater than the sum of the parts. And then at the same time, a part can very easily get hijacked if it's triggered, or if it's, if it's being pulled in a certain direction. There's a part of us that can get hypnotized by something where every other part of us is screaming, stop being hypnotized by that thing. I.e. a bag of chips, right? Like, there's a part of us that's like, no, I'm fully enmeshed in this bag of chips that I'm eating at 11 o'clock at night, and I'm just going to keep eating them, and I'm totally into this experience, so all of the other parts of me that's like saying stop eating the whole, damn bag of chips, you guys can all go to hell because it's just me and the chips right now. And so I do think that there are times when we get completely hijacked, and I do believe that sometimes we're just completely on autopilot. But that's a very interesting concept, this idea of being on autopilot. Because when you're on autopilot in a plane, it's not as if there were no instructions ever given to the plane, right? Like, it's not like the plane is just like, you know, you turn off all the controls once you're up in the air. That's not what autopilot is. Autopilot is that you've pre-programmed instructions, and then the plane is defaulting to the brain of the operating system to tell it where to go. So autopilot is not no instructions. Autopilot is pre-programmed instructions. And so I think the real leverage point in all of this, you know, these conversations that come up from these kinds of concepts, is what are we pre-programming into our GPS, so to speak? What have we programmed into autopilot so that once we go on autopilot, which we are pretty much 99.9% of the time, like with a little line over that 0.9, like we're on autopilot almost all the time. So there are just little snippets of moments when we emerge and go, oh my gosh, I'm in control of my life. I get to make a decision. Like I get to determine whether or not I'm the kind of person who goes and works out at a gym or goes and has like a workout regime. Or I can decide if I'm the kind of person who stays up late and eats an entire bag of chips at 11 o'clock at night watching, you know, like, I don't know. I don't even watch TV anymore, so I don't know what's on reruns. It would be a Netflix...
Green Acres.
Yeah.
I'm staying up to 11 o'clock watching Green Acres.
We are so out of the loop on what is on reruns. But it would be a Netflix, what do they call it? When you watch shows over
binge.
And over. Binge. It would be a Netflix binge for me. So, yeah, it's like there are moments when we get to decide that. What kind of person do I want to be? And it's like, it's almost like we shook ourselves loose. It's kind of like we just get this moment like, oh my gosh, I should totally start working out. And then we think about everything that's involved in that, and then we just kind of go, yeah, I'll set that up later. And we don't realize that was like a precious moment of programming we got, because we woke up for a second from our really busy lives, and we just went, oh my gosh, that's like, I could totally do something with my life. And then the next distraction comes, and then we get hypnotized again, and then off we go back on autopilot.
You know, as a feeler myself, I'll say this, I resonate with the idea that you're talking about these different parts inside of us. And I one of the biggest, like, quote unquote, grow up points in my life was realizing that I won't call it an infinite number of emotions, but there are a lot of emotions inside of me, right? And I think all of us have this. And as an ENFP and being a feeler, I have a tendency to be able to perceive a lot, not all of them, but a lot of the emotions that come up for me. And what's interesting about this, and this is the grow up moment for me, is I thought that my internal experience when I was younger all wanted the same thing, right? That's kind of what my mind and my heart felt, is like if I had a desire for something or if my emotions felt a certain way, that was true and authentic for me because that's what I was feeling, right, in the moment. And as I matured, as I'm at this place in my life right now, and I've got a lot more maturing to do, obviously, we all do, a lot more personal growth. But this place in my life, I realized that I am no longer the result of the emotion that's currently, I'll call it holding the stage or speaking from the stage right now. That literally just happens to be the emotion with the microphone and is the loudest right now. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the one that I truly want to be in charge. It's not the one that I feel is the most authentic to me or anything of that nature. It just happens to be the one that's driving right now in the moment. And again, this movie really kind of pointed this out. There were a lot of different emotions, some more positive than others. And it really depended on the situation for which emotion was appropriate. And sometimes when other emotions took the helm and it wasn't appropriate, it ended badly for the characters. And I think that's a really great illustration. It was a very oversimplified illustration, but it's an illustration nonetheless to how this kind of thing works. And oftentimes what's really crazy is it's not only who has control of the microphone and speaking the loudest is your emotion, but sometimes there's multiple emotions trying to express themselves at the same time, and they're in conflict with each other. And understanding how to almost be like a conductor in an orchestra for these emotions and keep them all calm and in motion and going the right direction is a lot of the work we do as humans emotionally. Like that's the emotional hard work we do. So let's just say, so an example of this, right? Let's say you're in an argument, you're listening right now and you're remembering a time when you've been in an argument with a lover, a spouse, a partner. You're in a really heightened state of, something's gone wrong and you've got to make sure you're proved right in the situation. And right now that emotion of wanting to be right, wanting to be, dominant, wanting to win is so strong. That's all you can see in the moment. And if you stopped for a moment, if you just went in the other room for like 5 minutes and really checked in with yourself, you'd probably see a few other emotions coming in. The emotion of love, the emotion of, wanting to reconcile with the person you're in love with, wanting to make sure you create a win-win. But they're so quiet right now because there's other emotions. Being a bully has come to the front and has kind of taken over in the moment, that you feel a little out of sorts. And so what we're talking about, a couple things here. First of all, that emotions are much more nuanced than just one or the other. You don't necessarily know what you want until you really examine all of these in yourself. And the other thing is, oftentimes we have patterns, like Antonia mentioned at the very beginning of this podcast. We've preset decisions ahead of time. So when you're in that argument with your spouse or your lover or your mate, you've already decided that you're going to escalate into wanting to win, as the emotion is the dominant emotion in that moment, instead of some other emotion, because that's where you have set yourself up. That's the emergent of a system you've set in place. And now you're sitting in a situation where in the moment, it's almost impossible to change that unless you go get distance and literally go into the other room and check in with yourself. So I think what we're talking about here are a couple things. We're talking about the plethora of emotions and sometimes conflicting emotions. And then the other idea of setting yourself up for decisions that are coming down the pike before they come down the pike.
Right. Because that idea, I think that's a really great example. That idea of like leaving the room to let your, to let cooler heads prevail. That's a habit. So is staying and being right and having to fight to prove that you're right, as opposed to wanting to create reconciliation. That's also a habit. So you pre-program inside of yourself which habit you're going to respond to by building the habit in the first place. You and I found that out the hard way with me. When I'm in emotion or when I'm in a fight, I can go to like a really bad place. like it can get really, like the gloves come off.
Gloves?
I introduce you to my fist names.
You were wearing gloves in the first place?
So, and we realized the hack is like, it's like if I'm in that space where I'm just like overwhelmed with an emotion, and usually for me, as somebody who's not a feeler, my emotions are very like, Hulk smash. Like I go to anger real quick because it's like the easiest one to hang a hat on. And if I can just walk away for like 10 or 15 minutes, not even 10 or 15, I think like 10 minutes is usually about right. If I can just break state and walk away and then come back, 10 minutes later, I'm like, sorry, I was a big total dick back there. I apologize. That was completely on me. I mean, like, I still feel like we should talk about whatever it is we're talking about, but I shouldn't have gone to that space. And if I can feel myself ramping up into that, then I just go, I need to go take a walk. And so that's a habit. And it took a while to get to a point where, because when I'm angry like that, when I'm in anger, there's no way that I can go, you know what? I think I'm really angry right now. And I'm like saying some stuff I shouldn't say. I think I'm going to go take a walk, right? And cool my head. Like it's almost impossible for me to actually have that cogent thought, because all I can think about is how mad I am or angry or insulted or offended or whatever it is that I'm like, caught up in the whirlwind of. And so that took a while to figure out. And once we did, now it's a habit. Now it's like we pre-programmed that if I'm in that space, I got to go take a walk. I got to go physically be away. And I think it was disconcerting for you to have me walk away, because it felt like I think we've actually talked about this in previous podcasts. It felt like I was like, quote unquote, hanging up the phone. We always call it hanging up the phone when somebody just refuses to engage in a conversation any longer, and they're done and they're over, and it's almost like they hung up a phone on you. So it feels to you like I'm hanging up the phone. When I'm not, I'm just trying to get a cooler head. But now we've pre-programmed inside you that when I do that, the assumption isn't that it's all going to be bad. And so we pre-programmed inside of ourselves to be able to control ourselves in those moments. But if we didn't have that pre-programming, once we get into those emotional spaces, once we're on autopilot, there's no changing course. Like, we're just going to fight to the bitter end unless we actually, before the fight starts, have made sure that we have, that we have something to control for that. And that had to happen before we even knew we were going to fight, right? And so I think there's a level of realism here too. Not having an idealistic perspective of ourselves. Not believing that when we get to a situation, we're always going to make the right choices or do the right thing. To go, yeah, I'm kind of a dick in some circumstances, and these seem to be the circumstances in which I have really terrible behavior. So these are the circumstances I'm going to try to pre-program or build habits that will prevent me from behaving badly and just getting caught up in this, this storm.
A great exercise that friends of ours have taught in their relationship course. This is just a quick example of what we're talking about. They have this great exercise where you create a soothing mantra for your mate, right? A soothing mantra for your lover or mate. And what this basically is you sit down in a very calm space, you pour yourselves a cup of coffee, you're in a great loving space, you're very happy, you're on the same page, and you ask your spouse or your lover and you say, when you are super upset, when you are the most angry or frustrated or sad that you ever are, what would you love? What are the words that you would love to hear me say to you? It sounds weird, right? It sounds very unromantic and very constructed. But what's interesting about this is if you sit down and do this with your mate or spouse or lover, and you write out the words that they would like to hear when they're in that heightened state of emotion, whatever that is, they give those words to you, the very word, and you practice saying that to them right in the moment when you create them, whatever those words are. And then you have this little card you carry around in your wallet or your purse or your pocket, or you have somewhere in your house where you can grab easily. And when they're in an emotional state, you actually literally go and grab that little mantra that they gave you. It's just a paragraph, maybe even shorter, a sentence or two. And you literally read that to them when they're in an upset state. And it's interesting to see how that alters an emotion, because there's a recognition by that person that they're the ones that gave you those words. They're recognizing, oh, wow, you're going meta. You're reading something I gave you that will soothe me. And then you're doing something loving toward them. You're saying the very words they've told you they want to hear in those emotional heightened states. So that's a very tangible exercise around what we're talking about figuring out ways to precede decision points for later on. And I bet you, if you sit down and do this exercise with your lover, that will actually preempt, if you know your lover has a soothing mantra on their end, I bet it'll preempt a large percentage of your intense emotional experiences, because you've already seeded something you know will solve the problem before you even get there. And if you are aware of that, that can alter how you'll show up emotionally to something. Yeah,
it's very diffusing of tension. And what's interesting is what you said just now, which is that, it feels like that would be a you didn't use the word contrivance, you said constructed. And it feels like it could be, perceived as a contrivance. And the first thing I thought of when you said that was, yeah, but aren't all stories? Right? Like, all the narratives that we have, this narrative of, like, I have to be right, isn't that a contrivance too? Haven't we just constructed a narrative or a story around whatever we're angered by, or upset by, or righteously indignant, or whatever the emotion, or very sad, or whatever it is? One of the most interesting things that I picked up from Eckhart Tolle was this concept that thoughts are concentrated emotions. Like, we aren't really sure. I mean, I'm going to extrapolate what that means on my own interpretation, but we aren't really, like, there's so many emotions that we experience, and they're so nuanced, and they seem to, or they can sometimes feel to run havoc within us, and we're so driven by them. They're such a massive part of our, motivation, that sometimes we get overwhelmed by them, and we just have to try to make sense of what's going on. So we construct a narrative or a story in order to try to make sense of our emotions. And really, when you peel away all of the narratives and stories, all you're left with are all of these emotions just sort of sitting there going, okay, so now what do we do? So all the narratives, all the habits we build, all of the words we say, all of the thoughts that we have are basically contrived stories in order to make sense of these emotions anyway. So why not conscientiously contrive stories or thoughts, or write words down on a piece of paper and hand them to your mate or a good friend or somebody who's close to you, or even a roommate, somebody who is going to be around you when you're not at the best of times, and go, this is what diffuses me. This is what puts me in a better emotional space. And it's okay if this is a contrivance, because it's all a contrivance.
Well, and like I said, I'm sure someone's listening right now and saying, that sounds very unromantic. That doesn't sound like they're spontaneously knowing what I need and being able to say it. And then I ask you, where did you get your notion of romance? I mean, that's a story you're running in your head right now, right? This idea of romance that you have, this narrative of how romance will play out for you, has been constructed also. And so I think that plays what you're saying is, yes, that might seem like a contrivance against another narrative you're running, but as far as like solving the problem or building a relationship of positivity and win-win, is that really a contrivance? Or are you looking for tools to use in the moment? And this is the kind of thing we're talking about. We're talking about figuring out ways to make those decisions before they're needed, figuring out ways to precede those emotional decisions. So when they come up, your emotions aren't in control of you, or at least it doesn't feel like they're in control of you.
Yeah.
And you have more influence over them. But in the moment, it's so difficult to have influence over your emotions. And I think that's what this movie really talks about, is in the moment, emotional control is difficult. And I think it was a great example. And if you've got kids, I would love for you to take them to see this movie or get this when it comes out on DVD or is, downloadable, because I think it's a great movie, especially for kids, to start introducing young children to this idea of how emotions impact us, how emotions play with our personality, how they play with our minds, and how we can navigate through this space.
Yeah, there was a really interesting, again, I don't want to make any spoilers, but there was a really interesting suggestion in the movie that, or at least the movie never said this. This was just what I picked up from observation. The emotion of joy was where resilience came from. Like this idea that just keep going. Like there's no, you can't stop. You just got to keep your head up, keep going. And yet the emotion of joy also had limitations. And the other emotions that were a part of, the primary, the 5 main emotions that were quote unquote in control, they had there were other things that they brought to the table. And that's part of actually what gets unfolded throughout the movie, which is, why wouldn't we always want to feel happy all the time? Why wouldn't we always want to be joyful all the time? But I thought it was really interesting to insinuate that joy is what gets us going. And I think I resonate with that. I think and it wasn't specifically happiness, but the character's name was Joy. And so there's this interesting concept that if we can program ourselves, like if we want resilience, maybe we should be creating or tapping into the emotion that helps us be resilient, right? Like as opposed to waiting for resilience to happen to us, why don't we take the side door and go, when I'm feeling resilient, what's the emotion that I'm feeling the strongest? And it might take a little bit to sort of fillet out and parse out and go, I think I'm feeling, powerful, or I'm feeling empowered, or I'm feeling happy, or I'm feeling content, or I'm feeling centered, or whatever it is. But if you want more resilience in your life, then figure out what the associated emotions are, and then figure out ways to get those emotions to come up for you, right? We behave as if emotions are just happening to us because that is how it's happening most of the time. And yet there is just a little window there. There's just a little sliver there where we can actually control it. We can install in ourselves our own brainwashing. I think that's what it is. It's this idea that none of us want to believe we're brainwashed. None of us want to believe that we're brainwashed at all. We all want to believe that we're totally in control of our thoughts. And yet, at the same time, we feel like we can't really control our emotions. Well, if thoughts are concentrated emotions, it means we can't really control our thoughts either. Or it means that we can control our emotions if we can control our thoughts. Does that make sense? It's like, it's almost like you can't have your cake and eat it too. Which one is it? Are you able to control your emotions because you can control your thoughts, or are you able to control neither? And I think what's really important to remember is that both of them are controllable for small amounts of time. But they're not always controllable in the moment. So if you're going to control them, you have to build systems. You have to precede systems before the decision time comes, or before the fight starts, or before you anticipate that lazy afternoon where you wanted to get a whole bunch of stuff done, but you didn't get anything done. Like, you've got to anticipate this. Are you going to be the kind of person who goes to the gym? What does that mean? Does that mean you're going to be able to motivate yourself to get there? And what is motivation for you? What are the emotions that are associated with motivation? And how can you, at the time before you got to go to the gym, how can you build a system where you are creating those emotions inside of you in order to have the result of getting to the gym? I remember just a really easy NLP exercise that we learned at, NLP stands for Neuro-Linguistic Programming. And you and I actually met at an NLP event. And I remember just one really simple little exercise that they did that I was like, man, that should not work. How is that working? They said, if you want to feel a feeling of power, you create a power circle, right? So you build this, you kind of mentally draw a circle in front of you. And when you step into the circle, that is the circle of power. And when you stand in it, you're going to stand up as straight as possible, put your shoulders back as far back as you can. You lift your head to the sky as if the sun is just beaming down on you. And you just have this feeling of, I'm magic, I'm Superman, nothing can tear me down. I am the most empowered, powerful creature on the planet. And I can just feel the sun, its energy just filling me with power. And then when you step back out of the circle, you go back to your normal posture. And you go, oh, that's not a very empowering posture. So anytime you want to feel powerful, You just step into your circle of power and you get into that stance again. Your entire physiology changes and your mood it follows your physiology. That was such an amazing, quick little illustration of how this all works, right? Like how our bodies are attached to our minds, which are attached to our moods. And if we just want to change our mood, we have to go back to the physiology. Or the opposite is true. Our minds are attached to our moods, which are attached to our physiology. So if we want to change our physiology, we got to change our minds. It's all interconnected, and it's a matter of figuring out which is the easiest trim tab for you. What's the easiest thing for you to hack into? I think it's one of the reasons why we originally called it personality hacker. People refer to us as the hackers, right? They'll call us the personality hackers, but we're not the hackers. We called it personality hacker because we want to provide tools for other people to hack their personalities. We're not the hackers. We want you to be the hacker. We want you to be able to figure out which one of these three components, the body, mind, and the emotions, which one is the easiest thing for you to hack into in order to control the other two.
Yeah, absolutely. And so a bunch of good stuff you just said, and it brought up something else for me, and we can keep unpacking this, but I get really excited about talking about this kind of stuff. So as you were talking, I'm just remembering the movie we watched, because that's kind of what started this whole conversation. And you just talked about hacking the mind, the body, or the emotions. But what's interesting about the movie we just watched, Inside Out, the Disney movie, Pixar movie, Inside Out, is that at the helm, at the driver's seat of behavior for this little girl, because basically the movie's a look inside her head, right? I mean, that's the whole movie. You look inside her head, you see stuff like short-term memory, long-term memory, her emotions, the way her thoughts are constructed, the different parts of her personality are constructed. But at the driver's seat, at the control board of her behavior, are her emotions. They've distilled it down to 5 basic emotions, but we could argue there's obviously many more than just 5 basic ones. There's a nuance and plethora of emotions. And I don't want to, again, spoil the movie for you, but as you watch, some of this kind of stuff becomes, observable in the movie. What's interesting about that, though, is if emotion is the driver of our behavior, that's interesting to people who don't believe, if you're listening and you don't believe that emotions drive you, they're not at the helm of your behavior, that might be interesting information to you to be awakened to.
Yeah.
Because I think especially in our modern world where we're very cerebral as people. I mean, I would say if you're listening to us right now, I don't care if you're a thinker or feeler as a personality type. I mean, I'm a feeler, and I think I'm a very rational person. I think I make good decisions. I make emotionally neutral, logical, thoughtful decisions with my life. And yet, when I really think about it, those decisions often are, or those thoughts are just explanations for the decisions I'm making, the emotional decisions I'm making. And it really comes from a place of emotion. And I'm a feeler. I'm in touch with this part of me. I show up to the world very in touch with my feeling nature, and I still think that I'm making rational, non-feeling decisions.
Yeah.
I can't imagine if you're listening and you're not somebody who has a feeling process as the way you make decisions, is your primary way of making decisions. That probably seems very foreign to you listening, that you use your decisions as the primary driver of all of your behavior. In fact, you might be listening to me right now going, no, I know that's not true. That can't be true. And you're resisting the very thing I'm telling you right now,
right.
Which is that your emotions have way more power over you, or at least are part of your decision-making way more than you probably thought.
I think as a thinker, I recognize that I can ignore pesky emotions when I want to. And I don't like when emotions cloud data points. Sure. I think data should not be a socially emotional decision. And at the same time, I don't know how a person could get around recognizing that we are fundamentally emotional creatures. Have we talked about it in previous podcasts, the Triune brain theory? That there's this concept that, as we evolved, our brains evolved different capacities over time. But the previous style of, fundamental rooted brain processing started with our lizard brain. So the triune brain theory is basically like we started out with, really close to our brainstem is the lizard brain, which is effectively our instincts for survival, right? Eat, sleep, breathe, like all the stuff that we need to do, just basically like it continue to exist as an animal. And then as as animals matured, or not matured, but evolved rather, as they evolved and got more sophisticated, then they created another layer that's called the mammalian brain. And the mammalian brain is where we gain all of our like social components. And that's where complex emotions really start to take roots, is in the mammal brain. Because we're social creatures, we're not just lizards living alone. We're now, in little makeshift pods and tribes and, flocks and murders if you're a crow, but whatever it is, we gather together, and because of that, now we have interactions with each other, and now we have emotional responses to each other. So our emotions get a lot more complex. And then further down the line, evolutionarily, then we eventually, as humans, we evolved a neocortex. And that's like the last third layer of the brain. And that's where we have like consciousness and analytical thought and the ability to, rationalize and create those stories. So I do think that thinkers are probably more in touch with their neocortex, or that cerebral part, as sort of being their identity. And at the same time, it's really hard to ignore that layer underneath the neocortex is the mammal brain, and it's not going anywhere. Like the mammalian, social, emotional part of us is going nowhere. So you might be able to ignore emotions longer than other people, but that doesn't mean you're necessarily like processing them better or less controlled by them. It just means that for the sake of the conversation, you can sort of set them aside when you need to. You can compartmentalize them a little easier for the sake of a story. That doesn't mean that they're going anywhere or that you're not controlled by them.
Well, I would argue then they may have more influence over you than you realize, because if you're someone that has that ability to compartmentalize them, basically what you're doing is you're removing the awareness of their impact on you while you're making decisions, while you're moving through the world and manipulating data.
Well, I would say that, this is just took a little bit of tangent on this podcast. We were talking about other stuff, but I think what I would say with this particular, like, is a thinker or a feeler more controlled by their emotions? I would say that it's contextual. Because feelers are taking emotions into account more often, they have a tendency to be persuaded by them more often. They have a tendency to be focusing on them and looking at them. And so they are quote unquote controlled by them in the sense that they're highly influenced by their existence. So it could appear as if they're more controlled. But then at the same time, a thinker that has the ability to ignore those emotions for a time, when they are controlled by their emotions, it's because it's coming in from the shadows. It's because it's not something that's on their radar. And then all of a sudden the thing is like, snuck up on them. And that's why when thinkers are controlled by emotions, they oftentimes are in what we call the grip. They don't know what's going on, and it's very powerful and it's very confusing, and they just kind of want it to go away as fast as possible. So I think it's a different kind of influence and control. And maybe that could be a future podcast.
Sure.
That said, it's actually a good way of looking at it. This question of, where are you more controlled? Is a thinker more controlled by their emotions, or is a feeler more controlled by their emotions? Or is that just where they're hanging out most of the time, and so that's where they're most influenced? And this goes back to what we were talking about originally, which is, how can you hack your own mind? How can you hack your own system to be able to make the most conscientious decisions possible? Because again, I've said this like probably 5 times, and I'm really beating this horse, but I think we only have slivers. I don't think that we are able to make conscientious, thoughtful decisions in the moment every time. It's so rare that we get the time to do that. So we have to take the opportunities of those quiet times, those introspective times, those moments when we go inside of ourselves and go, what kind of person do I want to be? How do I want to show up in the world? What are the things I want to be doing? Those moments when we actually have the decision points happen not at the moment, because when it's at the moment, the decision's already made. Whatever decision you make was inevitable. It's the moments before the moments that are actually when you are able to pre-program that GPS unit when you're on autopilot. So ask yourself, where is your greatest form of intelligence? If you're a thinker, it might be in weaving a narrative or a story and what we call thought, right? Like that might be where you're going to hack your system. You're going to go in through the thought processes and hack your framework or your paradigm or your belief system or whatever it is that whatever narratives and stories are going on. And then you are able to impact your emotions and your physiology, right? Your body going in through that, your awareness of thought and how thought impacts you. If you're a feeler, maybe the easiest way for you to hack your system is to go in through the emotional component, to be extremely aware of how your emotions are playing out inside of you or how your emotions are impacting other people. Maybe you're going to hack all of your physiology and your belief system through your emotional component. And if you're more of a kinesthetic person, if you're really in touch with your body, maybe you're going to hack your thought and your emotions through your physiology by doing physical activity that will get you in the space that you need to be in order to make the best choices. And maybe you're a thinker that has a bit easier time of hacking your emotions, and maybe you're a feeler that has an easier time of hacking your belief systems. Just ask yourself as a person, where is your highest levels of awareness? Where are your highest levels of awareness? And how are you able to become the kind of person you want to be through these thoughtful little hacks, right? These thoughtful little tweaks, and impact the entire system by going through the part that you're the most basically intelligent.
Yeah, and I think the advice I would piggyback and add to that would be make it as tangible as possible. So the exercise we mentioned earlier about writing down, literally sitting down with your lover and writing out mantras, is a very tangible exercise. You have a physical piece of paper with words on it in front of you that when emotions grip you, you can grab, and it's a tangible outward system or expression that your emotions are not dependent on, or your emotions are dependent on to reset yourself, but that system's not dependent on your emotions to be able to be used. It can be used independent of emotions because it sits externally from you.
Right.
So one of the challenges I've had in my life is, okay, I can prep myself emotionally to deal with the situation I know is coming. I've had some intense emotions with people. I knew they were coming. In some dealings with, somebody in my past or whatever, I've had to enter into a disagreement, or I knew it was going to be a disagreement when I entered into their presence. So what I would do is I would precede that with some physical things, some actual tangible things to help me in that experience. Just like anything in life, we prepare, we perform how we prepare, right? So if you prepare and the more physical and tangible those things can be, it's my perspective, my belief, you're going to have a much better time of being able to make better decisions when you're, quote unquote, in the grip of your emotions at the time they come up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's also wax on, wax off. Like in The Karate Kid, where Mr. Miyagi had the Karate Kid do the motion of wax on, wax off with his car. And then when he started, actually teaching him karate moves, it was the exact same motion that he needed to have mastered. And so he was much better at fighting because he had perfected the circular motion of waxing Mr. Miyagi's car. And I think we can do the same thing. We can exercise wax on, wax off in other, time periods of our life. For example, that, the concept earlier when you talked about would you rather be right in a fight and just, go down guns blazing in a fight with your, say, partner where it's very important and now you're creating schisms with your loved one? Well, you can practice that by getting into friendly debates with friends and then at a certain point just backing off, like not needing to be right in that particular debate, or finding yourself in a situation where you still feel like you're right. You're arguing with somebody at I don't know, the Apple store. And you're like, why is the iTunes so frustrating? And then you just kind of go, okay, well, but I'm going to back off the pedal even though I know I'm right on this one. And so you practice making peace with people in your everyday encounters. You practice not having to be right, but actually wanting to, create reconciliation. And so when you get into a situation where it actually matters, like whether or not you're going to have a good relationship with your spouse, you've already practiced getting into a debate and then backing off the pedal when things are getting heated, right? Like you might even kind of take it over a notch with your friends in a friendly, quote unquote, friendly debate and kind of push it a little bit just to kind of get it a little heated and then practice, backing off the pedal. You might want to tell your friend you're doing that before you do it. But it's just a matter of setting up circumstances where you can practice the behavior that you eventually want to do. I was thinking of, Steve Pavlina's recommendation: if you want to get up every morning and you have trouble getting out of bed in the morning and you want to get up at an earlier time, you actually practice the routine of getting up in the morning. Like you go through the motions of your bedtime ritual and you lay down in bed in the middle of the day, 2:00 in the afternoon, you lay in bed, you lay down for 5 minutes. and then you hear your alarm go off, and then you jump out of bed. And you do that over and over and over again, right? Like every time you hear your alarm, you jump out of bed, and then you build muscle memory inside your body to do this, so that when your alarm goes off the next morning at like 5:30 in the morning or some other ridiculous time, then your body is programmed now to jump out of bed and go do that thing. So I think on top of what you just mentioned, I think also, making sure that it's physical or like is an actual tangible external system you've built. I think also practicing like a wax on, wax off thing where you this is the result I want, so I'm going to keep practicing it even if it seems ridiculous in this context to practice it. I'm going to get it into my muscle memory. And that's self-brainwashing. Basically all you're doing is you're brainwashing yourself as opposed to like letting unknown things brainwash you, which we all do. We let unknown components brainwash us, but that's our own self-brainwashing to our, in order to generate happiness.
So there are more things about this movie we saw this past week, Inside Out, Disney's Inside Out, but we've been very cautious on this episode to not spoil the movie. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually finish up this podcast here, and we're going to release a second much shorter special podcast just talking about the movie itself and kind of piggybacking off this theme we talked about in this podcast that we'll release this week that you can listen to, but it's going to have spoilers all through it. So you don't want to listen to it unless you've seen the movie or don't care about having the movie spoiled for you.
Right.
Because we don't want to do that to you. So far, what do you think? We want to hear from you. What are your thoughts about these emotions, about how our emotions in control of us? Are we in control of them? About preceding things before they come down the pike? Emergent properties of systems, all these things we've been talking about. We'd love to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com. You can make a comment under this podcast, or you can also join us over at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack and join in the discussion on all of the different online communities of like minds just like you.
Yeah, you can also subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you have a hankering, we would love to hear your feedback on this podcast on iTunes. So please feel free to leave us a review and a rating.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And you've been listening to the Personality Hacker Podcast. We cannot wait to be talking with you next week. Same time, same channel here at Personality Hacker.